10 brazen serial killers who murdered in plain sight. Welcome back to Creepshow, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Tonight, we're going to confront the unimaginable. 10 serial killers who walked among us, hiding in plain sight, committing their horrific crimes without anyone noticing until it was too late. These aren't the killers who hid in shadows. They operated in the open, leaving a trail of devastation. It's the kind of evil that makes you wonder, could you recognize it if it were right next to you? Let's dive in. Number 10, Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Peter Kürten, known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf, was a sadistic killer whose reign of terror haunted Germany in the late 1920s. His methods? Brutal. Strangling, stabbing, beating his victims, often in public spaces as if daring the world to stop him. It was October 1929. Kürten spotted Elizabeth Dürrier, a young woman outside a crowded theater. Right there in plain view of so many people, he approached her, casually, like it was any ordinary evening. He convinced her to join him for a drink. No one thought twice. They moved from place to place, as if they were just two strangers enjoying the night, until they reached a quiet, secluded spot by the river. And then, his true nature emerged. Without warning, Kürten pulled out a hammer, the weapon of choice for this chilling murder. He struck her again and again, violent, relentless, and all of this out in the open, a place where anyone could have seen, where someone could have intervened, but no one did. And after the murder, Kürten calmly walked away, blending back into the city's everyday life, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just about the kill for Kürten, it was about the thrill, the sheer audacity, the fact that he could murder in plain sight and still vanish into the crowd. For Peter Kürten, the danger wasn't in getting caught. It was in the game of seeing how close he could get and how far he could push. Number 9, Craig Price. Craig Price is an unsettling name on this list, not just because of the violence he inflicted, but because of his age. Price was only 13 years old when he committed his first murder, making him one of America's youngest serial killers, a fact that still shocks and horrifies today. It began on July 27, 1987, a quiet neighborhood in Warwick, Rhode Island. A 27-year-old woman was found stabbed to death in her own home. The killer? A 13-year-old boy, Craig Price. At that age, no one could have imagined he was capable of such a brutal act. He returned to his life as if nothing had happened, blending back into the world like any other kid his age. But it wasn't over. 2 years later, in 1989, Price's violence escalated. He murdered again, this time a mother and her 2 young children. The weapon? A knife. He drove it so deeply into his victims that pieces of the blade actually broke off inside their bodies. A 15-year-old boy, committing such monstrous acts, walking among his neighbors like nothing had changed. Craig Price wasn't caught immediately. He went back to life as if nothing had happened. No remorse, no hesitation. The calmness with which he carried out these murders at such a young age is what makes him so terrifying. Price was eventually caught and is still in prison to this day. But the chilling question remains, how could a child commit such horrific acts and then return to normal life twice without a trace of guilt? Number 8, John and Ethyl Christie. John Christie, a name not as well known as some of history's infamous killers, but his actions were equally chilling. In post-war England, Christie lived a quiet, seemingly ordinary life. But behind closed doors, he was a vicious sadist, responsible for the deaths of at least 8 people over a span of 10 years, from 1943 to 1953. His partner in these horrific crimes? His wife, Ethel. Christie's method was as sinister as it was calculated. He preyed on vulnerable women, often prostitutes, offering them illegal abortion services. Once they trusted him, he would gas them, rendering them unconscious. But instead of helping them, Christie would strangle them and then violate their bodies in the most horrific way. He wasn't content with just killing. He needed control, power. To make matters worse, Ethel, his loyal wife, was right there by his side. Not only did she turn a blind eye, but she also provided him with an alibi when needed, helping cover up his gruesome acts. Bodies were hidden in their garden and even under the floorboards of their home, left to rot in the very space they lived. But in 1952, something unexpected happened. Christie, who had gotten away with murder for nearly a decade, made an unthinkable decision. He turned on Ethel, his partner in crime, strangling and killing her too. There's an unwritten rule among serial killers. Don't kill someone close to you. That's how you get caught. And that's exactly what happened. Christie had managed to evade police investigations for years, but murdering his own wife sealed his fate. He was finally arrested, and after a swift trial, executed on July 15, 1953. John Christie's reign of terror came to a fitting end, but the horror of what he and Ethel did, hiding in plain sight for so long, still lingers in the dark corners of history. Number 7. Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi, the Hillside Stranglers. The Hillside Stranglers, a pair of cousins, Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi, terrorized Los Angeles from 1977 to 1978. Together they were responsible for the brutal deaths of 10 women. Their crimes? Horrific. They kidnapped, raped, and strangled their victims before callously dumping their bodies in the hills surrounding Hollywood, a place so busy, so full of life, yet so unaware of the monsters operating within. These men didn't hide in the shadows. They hunted their victims from the heart of the city, often abducting women in broad daylight, a calculated risk in itself. And yet, their confidence grew with each kill. One of their most brazen acts occurred in November 1977. Dolores Cepeda and Sonia Marie Johnson, 2 young girls, were walking home from school. In a shocking move, the cousins abducted them, both at the same time, from the bustling streets of Los Angeles. Kidnapping not just 1 but 2 victims in broad daylight from the heart of a major city was an unfathomable risk, and yet they pulled it off, undetected. Their violence escalated, each murder becoming more reckless, more daring. They left their victims' bodies in public spaces, Hollywood's hills, where anyone could stumble across them. It was almost as if they wanted to be discovered, taunting the police with each new body found. Eventually, the law caught up with them, but the sheer audacity of their crimes, the confidence with which they operated in one of the busiest cities in the world, continues to haunt the legacy of the Hillside Stranglers. Number 6. Albert Fish. The name Albert Fish still sends shivers down spines nearly a century later. Known as one of the most depraved killers in history, Fish's reign of terror stretched from 1919 to 1930, culminating in a crime so horrific that it continues to haunt the American consciousness. In 1929, Fish, an elderly man at 57 years old, responded to a classified ad from the Bood family, who were looking for work opportunities for their 18-year-old son, Edward. The Buds could never have imagined the true nature of the man standing at their door. Fish presented himself as harmless, kind even. During the visit, young Grace Budd, Edward's sister, entered the room. She was just a child. And in that moment, Fish's sinister plan took shape. Pretending to be on his way to a birthday party for his niece, Fish somehow convinced the Buds to let Grace accompany him. An elderly man with a soft demeanor, he didn't look like a threat, so they agreed. In one of the most disturbing moments of trust ever betrayed, Fish walked out of their home with Grace Budd, right in front of her unsuspecting family. What happened next is almost unspeakable. Fish murdered the young girl in cold blood, committing acts of unspeakable violence, including cannibalism. But his depravity didn't stop there. Months later, Fish sent a letter to Grace's mother, detailing the horrific things he had done to her daughter. A letter so gruesome, it stands as one of the most chilling pieces of criminal evidence ever recorded. But it was that very letter that led to his downfall. Through careful investigation, police were able to track Fish and arrest him for his heinous crimes. He was eventually executed. But the horrors he inflicted, particularly on young Grace Budd, cemented Albert Fish's place as one of the most monstrous serial killers of all time. Number 5, Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper, standing at a towering 6'9", became known as the co-ed killer for the horrifying spree of murders he committed in California between 1972 and 1973. His victims? Mostly young women, including 6 female students, whose lives he ended in unimaginably gruesome ways. One of his most audacious crimes occurred in September 1972. Kemper picked up Aiko Koo, a young Korean hitchhiker, and drove her to a secluded location. As Kemper revealed his sinister intentions, he pulled out a gun, making it clear that her fate was sealed. But in an almost unbelievable twist of fate, Kemper locked himself out of his own car, leaving Koo inside. In a move that defies logic, Kemper simply asked the terrified young woman to unlock the door for him, and she did. Once back inside, he carried out his vile plan, raping and murdering Koo, but it didn't stop there. After the murder, Kemper placed her body in the trunk of his car and casually drove off, even stopping at a bar along the way to have a drink. With Koo's body still in his trunk, Kemper reveled in his own sick sense of accomplishment, completely unbothered by the horror of what he had just done. The chilling audacity didn't end that night. Kemper brought Koo's body back to his apartment, where he severed her head and kept her remains for several days. But perhaps the most brazen moment of all came shortly after the murder, when Kemper, needing to meet with a court-appointed attorney, drove to the meeting with Koo's severed head in his trunk the entire time. He sat through that appointment, carrying on like everything was normal, while a decapitated head rested in the parking lot. No one suspected a thing. And just like that, Ed Kemper walked away, free to kill again. Number 4, Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer is a name synonymous with horror. Known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, his reign of terror stretched from 1978 until his capture in 1991. Dahmer's crimes weren't just brutal, they were grotesque, involving dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. The discovery of what lay inside his infamous apartment, body parts in the fridge, skulls scattered throughout, and that iconic blue barrel of acid used to dissolve his victims, left the world shocked and horrified. But one night in particular stands out as one of the most bizarre in Dahmer's 13-year spree of violence that claimed 17 lives. On May 27, 1991, Dahmer lured a 14-year-old boy, Konorak Synthesamphone, to his apartment with the promise of money in exchange for posing for photographs. Once inside, Dahmer drugged the boy and, in a deeply disturbing act, drilled a hole into his skull, pouring acid into it in an attempt to turn him into a submissive, unresisting zombie. Now here's where things get truly unbelievable. With the boy unconscious and his twisted plan in motion, Dahmer left the apartment, leaving his still-living victim behind. He went out to a bar, drinking and buying more alcohol, completely unconcerned. When Dahmer returned, he was greeted by a scene no serial killer could have anticipated. The boy, dazed and confused, had escaped the apartment and was now surrounded by concerned bystanders. Synthesamphone, barely conscious, was in desperate need of help, and the police had already been called. In a moment of audacity, Dahmer convinced the responding officers that the boy was not 14, but actually 19 years old, and that they were lovers who had simply had too much to drink. Astonishingly, the police believed him. The officers even escorted both Dahmer and the young boy back to Dahmer's apartment, where they left him in the killer's clutches once again. Dahmer killed the boy just hours later. It's hard to fathom how close Dahmer came to being stopped that night, and the fact that he was able to talk his way out of such a situation is chilling. For Dahmer, leaving a victim alive while going out for drinks wasn't a mistake. It was part of his terrifying confidence. And that's what makes his story all the more horrifying. Number 3, Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper, arguably the most infamous serial killer of all time. His name is synonymous with fear, mystery, and brutality. Although his identity remains a mystery, his crimes have been studied and dissected for over a century, and his legend only grows with time. But perhaps the most audacious act of his killing spree occurred on the night of September 30th, 1888, in what's now known as the Double Event. That night, Jack the Ripper didn't just claim one life, he claimed 2 within the span of a single hour. His first victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found murdered around 1 a.m., her throat slit in a dark alley in the East End of London. The gruesome discovery was made mere moments after the crime, with investigators estimating that she had been killed just 30 minutes before her body was found. But here's where things get truly chilling. Just 45 minutes later, and less than a mile away, the Ripper struck again, this time taking the life of Catherine Eddowes. The police found her body in the same brutal state, with even more grisly mutilations. It's almost unthinkable that a killer would take such an enormous risk, knowing that the streets were already crawling with investigators after the discovery of his first victim. And yet within the same general area, he carried out another murder. The audacity of it all is staggering. Jack the Ripper, already the subject of growing fear and suspicion in London, seemed unfazed by the threat of being caught. It was as if his need to kill outweighed any fear of the authorities closing in. London was gripped with terror that night in 1888, and the double event became one of the most shocking moments in the Ripper's reign of terror. Even today, it stands as a chilling example of how relentless and fearless this unknown figure was. Number 2, Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, one of America's most notorious and chilling serial killers, left a trail of death and terror across 5 states, claiming the lives of at least 30 victims, though many suspect the true number could be far higher. What sets Bundy apart, aside from his horrific crimes, was his ability to operate in broad daylight, right under the noses of countless witnesses. Perhaps his most audacious act took place on a sunny day at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington, July 14, 1974. The park was crowded, filled with hundreds of people enjoying the summer, making it seem like the least likely place for a predator to strike. But Bundy had perfected his mask of charm and helplessness. Wearing a fake arm cast, Bundy approached a young woman named Janice Ott, asking for help. He told her he needed assistance loading a sailboat onto his car. Despite the crowded beach, Janice agreed to help the seemingly harmless man. No one noticed anything amiss as she walked with him, unaware of the danger she was in. When they reached his car, Bundy struck. He hit her with a crowbar, knocking her unconscious, and took her to a secluded location. What's most horrifying, though, is that he wasn't finished. 4 hours later, with Janice Ott already bound and suffering at his dump site, Bundy returned to the very same park. This time, he targeted Denise Naslund, who was just as unsuspecting. He kidnapped her in broad daylight from the same crowded beach just hours after taking his first victim. Denise, tragically, would later witness Bundy murder Janice before he took her life as well. Ted Bundy's boldness was staggering. He struck in broad daylight with hundreds of people around and took 2 victims in one afternoon, undetected, unseen. Witnesses would later recall seeing him at the lake, describing the man in the arm cast, but Bundy wouldn't be caught for years. His ability to manipulate, charm, and blend into everyday life made him one of the most dangerous and brazen serial killers in history. Number 1, Donald Harvey, the Angel of Death. Donald Harvey may not be as well known as some of the other killers on this list, but his chilling body count makes him one of the deadliest. Dubbed the Angel of Death, Harvey worked as a hospital orderly, a position of trust and care. But instead of helping patients, he took their lives, often right under the noses of doctors, nurses, and hospital staff. Over his time working in hospitals, primarily at Marymount Hospital in Kentucky, Harvey claimed to have killed up to 57 people. His methods, silent and cold-blooded, he would tamper with oxygen tanks, giving his victims faulty air, or even smother them as they lay helpless in their hospital beds. And all of this happened amid the daily chaos of a bustling hospital. No one suspected a thing. What's even more disturbing, his co-workers often joked with him about how many patients seemed to die under his care. Harvey played along, joking back, all while secretly continuing his deadly spree. In 1971, Harvey's killing spree nearly came to an end when he was arrested, not for murder, but for burglary. During his arrest, intoxicated and careless, he confessed to the murders he had committed up until that point. But despite his confession, investigators couldn't gather enough evidence to charge him with the killings, so he was let go, with only the burglary charge sticking. Harvey returned to his murderous ways, moving from hospital to hospital, where he continued to kill patients without arousing suspicion. He even extended his killings to friends and lovers. The sheer audacity of it is staggering. Killing people in a hospital, where the risk of being caught is sky high. How did he get away with it for so long? How did nobody raise the alarm? It seems unthinkable that hospital staff and professionals could overlook so many deaths, chalking them up to coincidence or even as a dark joke. Harvey's case forces us to confront a terrifying reality. Sometimes danger isn't lurking in the shadows. It's standing in plain sight, disguised in the places we trust most. From killers who prowled in the dead of night to those who struck in broad daylight, these murderers remind us that danger sometimes hides in plain sight. Could you recognize the warning signs, or would you fall victim like so many others? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the macabre, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more terrifying tales from Creepshow. After all, you never know who's lurking in the shadows. Until next time, sleep tight. Sleep.